Imagine for a moment historians of the distant future, grappling with the question of which event best described the latter 20th century. Would it be the explosion of the first atomic bomb, or the emergence of the internet, or even the astonishing creation of 500 channels of television without anything much worth watching? Perhaps. But then again, it just might be the moment on June the 24th, 1947, when the pilot of a single-engine plane, a salesman named Kenneth Arnold, was amazed to see 9 metallic objects zooming past Mount Rainier at impossible speeds. Flying, he said, like saucers would if you skipped them on water. In the following weeks, thousands of reports of flying saucers flooded in from much of the world. In the shadow of the atomic age, the era of UFOs had begun.
We lived our little drama, we kissed in a field of white, and stars fell on Alabama.
But why is this event so important that it should even be mentioned alongside the most expressive milestones of the last century?
We bring you this special radio television broadcast in order to give you the very latest information on an amazing phenomenon.
So this is the story of how that happened, and it begins, if it has a beginning, in the Pacific Northwest on the 24th of June, 1947. While he was flying home to Idaho at the end of a business trip, Kenneth Arnold spent an hour searching for a downed plane in the wilderness of Washington state. It was a bright sunny day with perfect visibility, but he had no luck. Arnold sold forest fire fighting equipment, hopping about the Northwest in his single-engine Call Air. As he turned towards home, a blinding flash of light caught his attention. He located its source as sunlight reflecting off the metallic surface of 9 objects flying south past Mount Rainier. Arnold clocked their speed over the 47-mile distance to Mount Adams at 1,800 miles an hour, almost 4 times faster than any plane known to be flying at the time. Thinking they might be test craft and 1,800 miles an hour was too fast to even contemplate, he cut it to 1,200 miles an hour when he reported what he'd seen to a local newspaper. The story was picked up by the AP wire service, and a headline writer labeled them flying saucers.
He certainly had to be flying in a very strong inversion. The possibilities of there being optical illusions in that situation was something that was a possibility. The mirages do seem to be moving and moving fast.
If it's a mountaintop mirage, which he's talking about, they stay above the tops of the mountains. They don't move laterally, and they fade in and out. And of course, they appear to be inverted images of the top of the mountain. Another more recent explanation was geese. The most recent one, which has actually led to a new terminology in ufology called pelicanism, where you take an explanation which seems, to me anyway, a careful analysis to be totally ridiculous, and you push it as hard as you can. Ornithologists think it could be pelicans. Pelicans can be very bright when reflecting sunlight.
And apparently they can move quite fast, clocked on Arnold's watch merrily gliding along at 1,800 miles an hour. Meteors have also been suggested, though how meteors could have traveled for 47 plus miles horizontally has never been explained, nor how they could resemble what Arnold drew. Even though there had been dozens of local reports of strange aerial objects in the preceding months, Arnold's sightings seemed to open a floodgate. Within weeks, there were more than 3,000 reports from across North America and around the world. Perhaps, it's been suggested, people were collectively suffering some trauma-induced delusion, a reaction to the threat of mass destruction of a scale never seen before.
The motion picture spectacle of all time. 1,000,000 tons of water alive with deadly rays. Awe-inspiring in its significance for man who learned how to control the atom, but must now learn to control himself.
In the midst of the 1947 flying saucer wave, on July the 7th, the Army Air Force Base at Roswell, New Mexico, the home of the only atomic bomb wing in the world, issued a press release that it had recovered a crashed disc. The DJ at radio station KGFL says he was the first to get the release from Walter Hout, the base PR officer.
He hands me this release, and he runs out. He said, "You got 30 minutes," and he's practically running out the door. And I'm looking at it, and I saw, flying saucer, and I said, "Wait a minute, Walter," and I'm going out hollering after him. He said, "I got to get back to the base. You got 30 minutes." I couldn't get him to stop. So I had to wait, because he said he's going back to his office. Had his number, called, got him. I said, "Walter, don't run this story. If you do, you're going to be in trouble. They'll ship you out to Siberia." I remember mentioning that. That was a common phrase in those days. And he said, "Look," he said, "the old man has cleared this. It's okay to use it."
The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
About that time, all hell broke loose. The wire went dead, and the phones began to ring.
And the cavalry came to the rescue. The next day at Fort Worth headquarters, General Roger Ramey informed a breathless media that the intelligence officers of the only A-bomb base in the U.S. arsenal had mistaken a common weather balloon for a crashed flying saucer. The press ran the story without so much as an arched eyebrow. And that was the last we'd hear of Roswell for another 35 years, when it would begin to blow up into the culture with all the power of an atomic bomb.
The long-awaited unification of the armed services comes a step nearer.
A few weeks after Roswell, the signing of the National Securities Act reorganized the armed forces and established the CIA and the National Security Council.
The Iron Curtain has descended across the continent.
The Cold War was officially underway. By August, flying saucer reports had dropped, and the press had pretty well assigned the subject to the crank file. After all, no one had seen or photographed one close up, and the military was at least publicly making light of the whole idea. But behind the scenes, things were different.
This was something that the intelligence community took seriously immediately. There was a desk called the Collections Desk in the Pentagon that was interested in dangerous possible invasions of American airspace. And this looked like that could be what this was all about.
The Pentagon sent a request for an evaluation to Air Materiel Command at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. After a preliminary intelligence gathering, a memo was sent back to the Pentagon by Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, the commanding officer of Air Materiel Command. It concluded that the phenomenon is something real and not visionary or fictitious, and that the extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, and motion, which must be considered evasive when sighted or contacted by friendly aircraft and radar, lend belief to the possibility that some of the objects are controlled.
The natural belief was that this must be Soviet technology. The idea that it was extraterrestrial did not really come up there at the very beginning.
Finally, Twining's memo went on to recommend a detailed codename study. Project Sign was approved at the end of December as part of the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It immediately had to contend with a disaster. An Air Force plane had gone down, chasing a UFO. On January 7, 1948, Kentucky Air National Guard Captain Thomas F. Mantell's F-51 fighter fell to Earth. He had been chasing a strange object in the sky. The Air Force accident investigators concluded that Captain Thomas F. Mantell had blacked out from lack of oxygen at 25,000 feet. 5 minutes earlier, he had radioed that he had spotted the object high above it and was climbing to get a closer look. He described it as metallic and tremendous in size. After Mantell apparently lost consciousness, his plane had climbed to 30,000 feet when it stalled and began its death spiral to Earth. News that a pilot had died chasing a flying saucer shot across the wires. The Air Force investigators announced that Mantell had died chasing the planet Venus, an explanation that seemed ridiculous given his description and eyewitness accounts of a large, slow-moving, cone-shaped object. In the early 50s, the Air Force's Project Blue Book revisited the case and concluded that the object was a top-secret Navy skyhook balloon used to study cosmic rays. However, it was under the shadow cast by the tragedy that the members of the Air Force's Project Sign began their investigation into flying saucers. Throughout the winter and spring of 1948, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Building T-2, they began to grapple with the fact that whatever they were, the saucers weren't foreign or secret domestic technology. Investigators went out into the field to quietly talk to people, many of them military, who had filed reports. By March, they had over 300 made by observers they considered competent. By summer, a debate was raging within the Sign team whether some of the objects reported were extraterrestrial. Then one night in July, an extraordinary incident unfolded.
The case that turned the corner for Project Sign has gone by the name of the Childs Whitted case, out of the two airline pilots that were the prime witnesses in the case.
Eastern Airlines Flight 576 was 20 miles south of Montgomery, Alabama at 2:45 in the morning of July the 24th, when Captain Clarence S. Childs and First Officer John V. Whitted saw an elongated wingless craft flash by their plane at what they estimated as 700 miles an hour. Both men described the object as metallic, with two lighted rows of windows. On Pentagon instructions, Sign investigators hurriedly flew off to interview Childs and Whitted. They were impressed with the two men's certainty that what they saw was a manufactured object. The Sign team was also aware of a report the week before from the Netherlands of a similar two-tiered craft, and other reports from across Europe of wingless planes. Within days of the Childs-Whitted sighting, the Sign team had committed to a conclusion.
The reason why Project Sign saw this case as being extraterrestrial was that this was an object flying freely and apparently maneuverably in our environment that had no wings. So where would the lift for a piloted craft of some kind come from? What they knew as technologists at Wright-Pat was the only way such an object could fly is if it had a tremendously powerful energy source. And the only thing they could think of would be something like nuclear. But they knew that they had nothing nuclear and no one else did either. They were stuck with the conclusion that this was an extraterrestrial device.
As traffic backed up with employees leaving Wright-Pat at the end of the midsummer workdays, the Sign team was hunkered down writing what they must have seen as one of the most important documents ever written. It was an estimate of the situation, required of all military investigations once they reach a conclusion. The estimate was then sent to the Pentagon, where it circulated to a very mixed reaction.
The majority of the people in the Pentagon at the time thought that this was not a message that they wanted to send out into the world or even into the military community itself, that this was just too strange and too dangerous. It was like an unknown wild card that they didn't want to let psychologically loose within their people.
The estimate worked its way up to the desk of Air Force Chief of Staff Hoyt Vandenberg, who was, we can assume, thrilled to see it. As what he did with the estimate is a crucial juncture in this story, it's worthwhile to consider his decision options. He could 1. Reject the estimate straight away and bury its conclusions. 2. Order further study, which would serve to keep its conclusions alive with the possibility of leaks. Or 3. Accept the conclusions, which would mean admitting to the Congress, the President, and the American people that the Air Force was powerless to prevent extraterrestrials of unknown origin, and worse, unknown intent, from overflying the United States. Researchers who believe that a flying saucer crashed at Roswell are of the opinion that Vandenberg's decision was made to perpetuate a cover-up. But Roswell is not necessary to understand why the estimate was quashed. Simple convenience suffices. The idea it advocated was dangerous, the effect on the population unpredictable. Authority fears and loathes one thing above all. Vandenberg let it be known to the SIGN team that their conclusions had no supporting evidence. All copies of the estimate were ordered destroyed. The SIGN team was disbanded and replaced by Project Grudge, whose mandate apparently was to give the public mundane explanations for all sightings, and shift the emphasis from the reports to the people making them. Flying saucers were to be a psychological problem. In December of 1948, just as Project SIGN was being replaced by the Saucers Don't Exist Project Grudge, a series of sightings called the Green Fireballs began over sensitive military installations in New Mexico. They were seen by dozens of scientists at the Los Alamos Nuclear Research Installation and by hundreds of military personnel. At least 39 reports were sent to Grudge by April of '49. There was great concern in the scientific community about what they were, but Project Grudge, true to its name, seemed to begrudge all requests to investigate. A few months later, Grudge cooperated with the Saturday Evening Post on a major two-part article debunking saucers, only to see sightings immediately hit an all-time high. 2 days after the article, a fateful telegram arrived on the desk of a retired Marine major and former aide to Charles Lindbergh, now a successful journalist. Have been investigating flying saucer mystery. First tip hinted gigantic hoax to cover up official secret. Believe it may have been planted to hide real answer. Looks like terrific story. Can you take over Washington End? Ken W. Purdy, editor, True Magazine. Initially skeptical, Donald Kehoe took the assignment and began 6 months of research drawing on his extensive contacts in the military. The subject of flying saucers would never be the same. Meanwhile, through the rest of 1949, the team at Project Grudge did their best to shoot down any and all sightings. They were aided in their mission by their new astronomer consultant, J. Allen Hynek.
Hynek was very skeptical. From the beginning, he assumed that all reports were explainable in conventional terms. And that is, in fact, what he did. That was his function for the Air Force. They would take the cases to them and they say, we can't explain this, as we can't trace a weather balloon. Is this a comet, a meteor, a planet? And Hynek would provide the explanation.
Donald Kehoe's True Magazine article appeared just before New Year's 1950. It was the largest selling issue in the magazine's history.
This was a sensation. This article got press coverage all over the world. Kehoe concluded from interviewing his Air Force contacts, interviewing pilots, other credible witnesses, that flying saucers were coming to Earth, and they'd started watching us intensely because they began monitoring our atomic bombs.
In 1950, men throughout the world learned to look on the brutal face of communism. Berlin powder-coated.
As the road to the Korean War became a one-way downhill street, a pillar of the community farming couple in Oregon, on a nice May evening, noticed a strange object in the sky. The pictures that Paul Trent and his wife took would be among the most highly analyzed UFO photos ever taken. And while there have been many attempts to expose them as faked, the efforts have been far from convincing. And there was also the lifelong character of the Trents.
Everybody says straightforward, honest. The chance of them making up a hoax like this is zero.
A few months later in August, in Great Falls, Montana, Nick Mariana, the general manager of the city's baseball team, shot some 16mm film of what he described as two silent, disc-like objects. Mariana showed the film around town numerous times, including at club meetings at the Park Hotel.
The little booth next is a visiting broadcast booth.
Gene Black, the son of one of the board of directors of the club, later to become the team's announcer, remembers being at a screening.
Good view. Shiny, saucer-shaped things.
Though his recall is spotty after 5 decades, like others who saw the film, what impressed him was how they were stationary discs that took off at a great speed.
Hovering.
Standing still.
Yeah. But as he's standing there holding the camera, they all just started to go up very slowly. And it went.
In September, the Air Force heard about the film and asked Mariana for the footage. He was happy to oblige. In October, Project Grudge announced their photo analysts were unable to find anything of an unusual nature. Mariana, in a huff, asked for his film back. When it was returned, he claimed the first 35 frames were missing. The frames, he and others who'd seen the film said, that clearly showed two spinning disc-like objects. The Air Force denied the frames were tampered with. Mariana pointed to a splice where the leader joined the film. His splicer was perpendicular. The splice at the head of the film was diagonal. The missing frames, if Mariana and others were telling the truth, have never surfaced to this day. Around the same time that Grudge was publicly dismissing the Mariana film, a foreigner was visiting Washington with flying saucers on his mind. Wilbert Brockhouse Smith, a senior radio engineer at the Canadian Department of Transport, was attending a conference. Smith was doing research into geomagnetism and had been interested in flying saucers from the first reports in 1947. According to a confidential memo to his transport superiors that was discovered in the late 70s, Smith made discreet inquiries through the Canadian Embassy to a high-ranking U.S. Defense Research Board scientist, Dr. Robert I. Sarbucker. The memo described what he learned. The matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the H-bomb. Flying saucers exist and their modus operandi is unknown, but concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. The entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. 1951 would be a slow year for saucers, but a striking multiple radar and visual case over the New Jersey coast involved the local Air Force base at Fort Monmouth. Project Grudge was now moribund, and the commanding officers sloughed off the incident, calling it radar artifacts. When this came to light at the Pentagon, it caused a major stink. Major General Charles Cabell, the head of Air Force intelligence, went ballistic.
And he stormed around pointing at various people who were also there in his audience saying, "I've been lied to and lied to and lied to." He says, "I demand that this subject be taken seriously."
Cabell had Grudge reorganized under more open-minded officers and renamed Project Blue Book.
And at that time, probably the most sympathetic Blue Book chief at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was installed, and that was Captain Edward Ruppelt.
Ed Ruppelt was an aeronautical engineer and a good organizer. More importantly, he had a sense of history. Much of what we know about the early years comes from the book he wrote when he left the service. The New York Times, hostile to the whole idea from the start, sneered that the subject had as much reality as the Loch Ness Monster. and the first debunker appeared. Donald Menzel was a prestigious Harvard astronomer who employed all his political and media connections to discourage anyone from taking the subject seriously.
He had enough cachet as a Harvard astronomer to get into Time magazine and places like that with his idea that it was all oddball radar reflections and plasma effects and a bunch of misinterpreted nonsense.
According to Ed Ruppelt, Menzel and his strained explanations garnered little more than contempt at Air Force intelligence. They had their hands full with the practical problem. The Great Saucer Wave of 1952 had broken in June, sending everyone scurrying to keep up. Reports for the month totaled 144, the highest number ever. July would more than triple that. On July 14th, the pilot and co-pilot of a Pan Am flight off the coast of Virginia watched 6 bright orange discs flying in a line, flip on edge, get joined in their echelon by another 2 discs, and disappear off into the distance at a speed they clocked at an astounding 12,000 miles an hour. Donald Menzel would toss out many explanations for the Nash-Fortenberry incident. That old standby meteors was one. It's an interesting irony that the scientists of the 18th century couldn't accept that rocks could fall from the sky. Menzel also suggested searchlights playing on clouds, although a quick check of the weather would have shown it was a cloudless night. Then he tossed out reflections in the cockpit glass of lighted cigarettes in the passenger cabin, and finally, in what may have been a stretch for the ages, fireflies trapped between the windshield panes of glass. But the Nash-Fortenberry incident was just a harbinger of what was to come less than a week later, with a series of events that would completely change the history of the phenomenon. The midsummer of '52 was when everything changed.
We're talking about a massive wave of sightings, and they were getting 20 or more sightings per day.
They are flying all up and down the East Coast, and some people actually predicted, because of the way they were doing it, that they would probably show up in Washington, D.C., and there, in the middle of July, they did.
A cluster of 7 blips 10 miles southwest of the capital was first noticed at 11:40 p.m. Saturday, July 19th on the long-range radar at Washington National Airport. One of the operators looked out and saw a bright orange light. When the blips started showing up over the White House, Harry Barnes, the senior traffic controller, called Andrews Air Force Base 10 miles to the east. An Andrews controller was soon seeing bright orange objects flashing through the sky. As the runways at Andrews were under repair, jets would have to be dispatched from Newcastle Air Force Base, 30 minutes away in Delaware. Meanwhile, a Capital Airlines flight taking off from National was vectored towards some radar blips to the west. As they approached the area, they saw nothing unusual. Suddenly, a bluish-white light flashed in front of them on a 25-degree dive. Then another one shot from behind them, zooming up and out of sight. In the next 7 minutes, they watched 7 more lights, all being simultaneously tracked on the radar back at National. The most spectacular incident happened when National Tower informed Andrews that they had a target right over the base. The operators looked out and saw a huge, fiery orange sphere. When the jets finally arrived from Delaware, all the blips disappeared, only to return when the jets departed. Harry Barnes would later tell the newspapers that he felt the targets were somehow aware of their communications.
The little dance went on for a couple of times, and it boggled everybody's mind.
The night of Saturday, July 19th, dramatic though it was, would just be the warm-up act. The following Saturday at 9:30, both radars at Washington National and the one at Andrews started getting returns, as visual sightings poured in from all over the area. Al Chop, the public information officer at the Pentagon for UFOs, who was a confirmed skeptic when he started the job, was called out to the tower at Washington National at midnight. There was total confusion as reports of objects were coming in droves. Some of the radar blips were solid, some less so. One airline pilot, after making multiple passes over the spot he'd been vectored to, concluded the target was a riverboat plying the Potomac. 2 jets had arrived earlier, and again the objects had disappeared. Now, as CHOP was present, a second pair arrived. One was vectored to an area 10 miles out of the city, which showed radar targets. As he approached, he described 4 white glows and began to close in for a much-anticipated intercept. But as CHOP and the controllers watched on the scope, the object shot right at the jet and surrounded it. According to CHOP, the pilot radioed them for instructions asking, "What do I do now?" Then the glowing orbs zipped off. After that, Al CHOP was no longer a skeptic about UFOs. Monday's banner headline in the Washington Post caused mounting concern of a public panic. On Tuesday morning, the largest and longest Air Force press conference since the Second World War took place. The brass, with all carefree smiles, suggested that a temperature inversion could have caused the radars to pick up ground vehicles as airborne objects. The majority of the media ran with this. But behind the walls of the Pentagon, in the offices of Air Force intelligence, all explanations were still very much on the table. During the height of the flap, Ed Ruppelt had taken a call from Harry Truman's military aide, General Robert B. Landry, demanding answers.
And he told them that they didn't know what they had on their hands. Well, it took Harry Truman 1 day to order Landry to go to the Joint Intelligence Committee and to order a study of this.
Aside from the question of what had just happened, the Washington flap had caused a major communications breakdown.
The hysteria, the jamming of the telephone lines, where you couldn't even call the Pentagon.
When the request at the Joint Intelligence Committee came down to take a look at UFOs, the logical place for that request to be studied was some agency other than the one studying it already, which was the Air Force. And so they picked the CIA.
Fred Durant, a rocket engineer, was in the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence.
The ball was handed to me.
Did the CIA have concerns about the competence of Blue Book?
As far as competence, well, it was obvious it did not have professional competency above an engineer.
While Ruppelt was an aeronautical engineer, he was just a lowly reserve lieutenant, and his understaffed little project was now in the glaring spotlight of the entire Cold War security apparatus. Durant and his cohorts from the CIA went to Wright Pat to examine Blue Book's methodology. After sniffing around, the CIA decided to have a scientific panel to evaluate the Air Force evidence.
CIA wanted to keep this as an internal project, which they had complete control over. So rather than going to a good high-tech science group out of which we might have gotten a rather nice estimate, again, of what the phenomena was, what happened was that they went to internal CIA consultants, the most well-known of which, and a person who had been chief consulting scientist for the CIA in the past, was a guy named Dr. Bob Robertson, H.P. Robertson, a nuclear scientist, more or less a mathematician from Caltech.
The Robertson panel met in secret over 4 days at the beginning of January 1953 and spent a total of 12 hours reviewing in depth only 8 cases of the hundreds that Blue Book had on file as unknowns. As an example of their in-depth review, they concluded that the Great Falls, Montana film, taken by Nick Mariana, was of 2 fighter jets in the area. This despite Mariana's claim he observed the jets a few minutes later. and Ed Ruppelt's reinvestigation that concluded the planes were nowhere as near Mariana as the objects on the film.
The Robertson panel report was basically there for everybody to sign the next day, and it had already been passed to the Chief of Air Force Intelligence for his approval.
The Robertson panel concluded that as reasonable explanations could be suggested for most sightings, all sightings might be explained in a similar manner. It also recommended that to eliminate national security communications problems, and the communists using UFO hysteria to their advantage, that the subject be debunked and ridiculed, so the public would no longer take it seriously.
If you wanted to eliminate a national security problem with this, you needed to change the attitude of the American public to this phenomena. And the only effective way of doing that was to make it be a joke. There was no science in this science committee report. It was all about national security.
The world's first hydrogen bomb, housed in this barn-like building, was to be exploded on a tiny target island.
In the wake of the Robertson panel's recommendations, Project Blue Book was repurposed. Its funding shrank and Ruppelt soon left the service. Blue Book continued, but its role now seemed to be to carry out the Robertson panel's recommendations and debunk UFOs. Behind the walls of the Pentagon, the extraterrestrial debate at the top levels of Air Force intelligence petered out. The Washington flap had rattled the windows in the corridors of power and raised concerns about public hysteria in the perilous times of the Cold War. A brief period of open inquiry had come to an end, and a dark curtain of denial had once again descended. In the wake of the 1966 swamp gas fiasco, the Air Force approached a number of A-list universities to conduct a serious scientific study of UFOs, and was turned down flat. Finally, the University of Colorado, running low on federal grant money, considered accepting. Heading the study would be the respected physicist Edward Condon.
Edward Condon didn't want to do this for the Air Force, even though he'd done a lot of military consultancy work before, because he was like most other people in the scientific community. He thought the whole thing was nonsense and not worth his time. But University of Colorado needed some money.
Robert Lowe, the person who would administer the project, pitched it to one of the university trustees thusly. The trick would be, to the public it would appear a totally objective study, but to the scientific community it would present the image of a group of non-believers trying to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer.
And that was Bob Lowe, the used car salesman, saying what he had to the Board of Trustees to relax them so they could put their imprimatur on the project.
When discovered later, the memo would have disastrous consequences and convince the civilian research groups, who'd enthusiastically cooperated up to that point, that a fix was in. It turned out they were right, but not because of the Lowe memo. As the study was getting underway, Condon and Lowe met with their Air Force liaison, and incredibly they asked him what result the Air Force would like. The leaders of what's supposed to be an inquiry into the reality of UFOs, asking for direction from the agency who'd been proclaiming for 2 decades that there was absolutely no reality to them whatsoever. The liaison officer replied that the Air Force was tired of funding Project Blue Book.
And what he says to Condon is, this project has been a source of a lot of irritation, really, to the Air Force and a lot of expense. And we really need to get rid of this. And if you find that you don't have enough money to come to a proper conclusion, reapply and you'll get more money.
The Colorado study brought on board a team of 8 scientists, engineers, and psychologists. Alan Hynek consulted, as did Kehoe and NICAP, and an atmospheric physicist from the University of Arizona, Dr. James McDonald.
In 1954, he had a UFO sighting, what we would call a daylight disk, and it was really a very puzzling sighting, a good sighting, obviously a very good trained witness. But he didn't do anything with it because he was starting his scientific career.
In the mid-60s, MacDonald picked up the study of the phenomenon with a vengeance, reading through all the Blue Book files and the extensive public literature.
He went through all of this in a period of months, began talking with witnesses, was really impressed with the quality of evidence, and he thought that this was the most important overlooked scientific question of the century, maybe one of the most important of the millennium.
MacDonald was fearless, vocal, and tireless.
He began giving hundreds of talks, and I mean hundreds of talks. And a lot of scientists in these prestigious organizations began to take an open interest in the subject of UFOs.
Meanwhile, back at the University of Colorado, Condon was spending little time with the project. Instead of doing any field investigation, he was enjoying the company of contactees and regaling his professional colleagues with their absurd tales. When Jim MacDonald gave a seminar in the summer of '67, Condon fell asleep twice. That same summer, Roy Craig happened upon Lowe's trick memo in the files, the one written to sell the university trustees on the project. Disturbed, Craig showed it to Norman Levine and David Saunders, two of the project's staff who were most bothered by Condon's behavior. Saunders showed it to Kehoe, who gave it to Jim MacDonald, who mentioned it in a long letter to Lowe about the negative direction the project seemed to be taking.
Bob Lowe was very, very worried about this, but Ed Condon, typically of him, was explosive about it. He considered this to be an issue of betrayal on the part of what should be a private in-house team. And he called David Saunders and Norman Levine in, and he just fired them. And he not only fired them, but he told them that if he could, he would ruin their academic careers over this.
As threats of suits and countersuits filled the air, Lowe's assistant administrator resigned, citing an almost unanimous lack of confidence in his objectivity.
All these people are falling out of this so-called objective scientific project. They're dropping like flies. And what you have left over is Ed Condon and Roy Craig and a bunch of other people who've basically been added on at the last second, trying to cobble together a mishmash of documents that they've called the scientific study of UFOs. Well, it was a terrible piece of work.
The report was immediately hailed by the New York Times science reporter, who it turned out had already written the laudatory introduction to the paperback edition. Its 1,485 pages were prefaced by Condon's 50 pages of negative conclusions, conclusions that dismissed or ignored much of the analysis in the body of the report. Bill Hartman, extremely skeptical about UFOs, had nevertheless concluded about the Trent pictures that all factors appear to be consistent with the assertion that an extraordinary flying object flew within the sight of two witnesses.
He, in his conclusions, completely ignores talking about that, and in fact infers the opposite. No question.
Yeah, I think infers the opposite is fair. I don't know quite what to say. I think what you're saying is basically right. Whether those conclusions should have been written totally differently, I suspect they should have been. You don't write those things without sort of knowing what the consequence is going to be for people at his level. And I don't know, maybe he's just even more deviously canny than I'm saying, because maybe he just figures, well, if I, Edward Condon, say there's nothing here in this report, nobody will bother to go really further.
Both MacDonald and Allen Hynek fought tenaciously against the acceptance of Condon's conclusions within the scientific community, but it was a losing battle. The Air Force shut down Blue Book, and Kehoe's NICAP went into a steep membership decline. MacDonald sunk into a depression from marital problems and would soon take his own life. Hynek soldiered on, founding the Center for UFO Studies, but the ground was shifting in a fundamental way.
As proof of the extraterrestrial hypothesis remained elusive, some ufologists began to look in other directions.
As the late 60s saw the planet as a whole, undivided by artificial boundaries, The decade had also brought into the culture the Eastern notion of expanded consciousness, and tagging along its frequent fellow travelers, the paranormal and the occult.
In 1969, Jacques Vallée wrote a book called Passport to Magonia, where he links modern UFOs to traditional beliefs about fairies, demons, gods, entities of various kinds.
Jacques Vallée had been one of Allen Hynek's graduate astronomy students, and Vallée's influence had been one of the reasons for Hynek's change of heart on UFOs. In his new book, Vallée pointed out that the reports of fairy encounters of yore and modern UFO occupant reports had many qualities in common. In Europe, many researchers embraced this idea, that UFOs were the modern face of an old phenomenon, one that was psychosocial in nature, not extraterrestrial.
The whole premise was that these things couldn't be happening. This was implicit. It was really the debunking view by another more pretentious name. And so there was this great effort to study the most extreme kinds of experiential claims, and without really much empirical investigation or documentation, just claiming that by their nature they were explainable as the witnesses' deep-seated psychological or spiritual needs, often ascribed to witnesses that the writers had never met and knew nothing about except what they had reported.
As if to offset all this armchair theorizing, 1973 saw a massive UFO wave. In one spectacular episode, 4 Ohio National Guardsmen reported narrowly averting a collision with an object that stopped for a few seconds above them.
It was so close to us. At that time, I was concerned that we might have a blade strike because I could see the tips of the rotor blades reflecting off the light, and it was awful close to that. And it was, as they say, this big thing in front of us, big black solid thing, because the stars were gone in front of us. I don't know, I'm guessing 80 feet maybe long.
What were you thinking when you looked at it?
I was awestruck.
The entire event was observed by a family on the ground. Philip J. Klass, an aviation journalist and the arch UFO skeptic now that Donald Menzel had retired, explained that what the guardsmen saw was a slow-moving meteor.
That's worse than swamp. That's worse than swamp gas.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon.
But as the times grew in uncertainty, so it seemed did the will to believe in cause and effect connections that strained facts, especially archaeological ones.
Our lot didn't know about astronauts, but we do.
The 1974 documentary Chariots of the Gods popularized the notion that the mysterious wonders of the ancient world were attributable to alien astronauts. The film grossed $25 million.
The giant drawings must have been made for someone arriving by air.
But if extraterrestrials had made contact with our primitive ancestors, they remained stubbornly aloof from us, except apparently in rare incidents. One in particular that revealed that a face-to-face encounter with an advanced non-human intelligence might have profoundly disturbing undercurrents. Toward the end of 1975, in the forests of northern Arizona, a truck carrying home 6 loggers stopped when they noticed a glowing object in a clearing. Travis Walton jumped out and walked towards it. His friends told the police that they took off in fright when they saw him knocked flying by a bright blue flash, and that when they returned 15 minutes later, he was gone and so was the object. 5 days later, a shaken and dazed Travis Walton called from a roadside phone. He didn't remember much about what happened, but he would never forget the moments after he regained consciousness.
I was in a lot of pain, and I didn't remember what had happened at first. But then that kind of came back to me, but I still didn't put it together with where I was. I was thinking that I'd been hurt and they'd taken me to a hospital, and that, you know, that's where I was, that there's sounds of movement around me, that these were doctors, and, you know, things were under control. there was some sort of a device pressing down on my chest, and you know, all of the pain and everything made me feel like I just better stay still, because you know, that's what you do in a situation when you're being treated. Right. But I don't think I was being treated. When I finally, you know, could focus my eyes and saw, you know, where I was and saw these creatures, just to look into the eyes of something, a thinking creature that wasn't human. It was just, it was a shock that, you know, that instant is something that'll never leave me.
By the late 70s, requests made under the new U.S. Freedom of Information Act were revealing a fascinating series of incidents at Minuteman missile bases along the U.S.-Canada border, and showing that despite the end of Project Blue Book, the Air Force continued to investigate UFO reports involving its personnel and facilities. It was a period of flux, when the modern history of the phenomenon was about to make a radical course change. The fateful moment arrived as a tip from a television station manager.
Out of the blue, he says, you know, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. And brilliant investigator that I am, I said, who's he? And he says, oh, he handled the wreckage of one of those saucers you're interested in. He was in the military. What?
The events related by Major Jesse Marcel, retired, former intelligence officer of the 509th Atomic Bomb Wing at Roswell, New Mexico, would provide the seed for a crashed saucer story that would take root and grow like an enormous weed to overrun the UFO landscape. Witnesses were discovered who reported a massive recovery operation. More witnesses came forward claiming they saw wreckage and bodies.
By 1980, we talked to 62 people. By 85, it was 92 people.
Around the same time, the memo that Wilbert Smith wrote to his superiors in Ottawa back in 1950 was discovered in his papers. The one reporting on his conversation with Defense Research Board scientist Dr. Robert Sarbucker that a crashed saucer was being analyzed by a small group of top-level scientists led by Defense Research Board Chief Vannevar Bush. Sarbucker was still alive, and when contacted, he confirmed the contents of the Smith memo. It seemed that a cover-up was finally beginning to unravel. Then, in the mid-'80s,
documents began to appear, documents of unknown provenance, for the most part.
The MJ-12 documents seemed to confirm the Roswell crash in the New Mexico desert. They purported to be an eyes-only briefing given in 1952 to Dwight Eisenhower about Operation Majestic 12, an above top-secret project dealing with crashed saucers and their occupants. Prominently mentioned was Dr. Vannevar Bush, thus seeming to confirm Wilbert Smith's memo. Also present others who weighed heavily in the history of the phenomenon, including the arch-debunker Dr. Donald Menzel, confirming many a UFO researcher's suspicion that debunkers are really government agents. Also looking for coded messages from the stars, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI projects, were getting underway. One of the major objections by the scientific community to the idea of flying saucers zipping around our planet was the limiting factor of the speed of light, a consequence of Einstein's special theory of relativity. If nothing could travel faster than light, a jaunt to just the nearest star would take an absolute minimum of 4.5 years. Therefore, scientists reasoned that if anyone traveled the vast distances, even in our local neighborhood, it would be very rarely, and it wouldn't look like the seeming traffic jam being reported. So SETI project started up with the idea that smart aliens would stay home and contact us by an interstellar version of an inexpensive long-distance card. Of course, all this assumes that the speed of light cannot be sidestepped in ways unknown to our present physics. Given the ever-changing history of physical laws over the last few hundred years, that assumption would appear to be more a leap of faith than science.
It's also part of the in-training of a scientist to set borders on what that scientist believes is the nature of reality. And it's a lot more comfortable if you have the arrogance that you think you're going to explain everything sooner or later, to have a rather narrow set of fences.
The early 90s saw growing media fascination with the Roswell incident. New Mexico House Representative Stephen Schiff asked the Air Force about it and hit a bureaucratic stone wall. Annoyed by the lack of response, he requested the General Accounting Office to investigate Air Force communications in and out of Roswell in 1947. The Air Force subsequently decided to conduct their own inquiry.
First of all, the report was prepared by counterintelligence people within the Air Force. It's a case of the fox, guarding the hen house, I think.
The Air Force report was prepared by the same Pentagon personnel that many researchers believe had authored the MJ-12 documents. Its 998 pages concluded that there was indeed a cover-up, but it was only of debris from a secret Project Mogul balloon launch that had gone missing. Moguls were huge balloon assemblies intended to explore the possibility of remotely monitoring Soviet A-bomb tests. But there were multiple problems with the explanation. First of all, there was no definitive evidence outside of one scientist's 50-year-old memory that the particular Mogul launch had ever taken place. And then, even leaving aside the multiple witness testimony about the unearthly nature of the material recovered, the apparent size and secrecy of the recovery operation itself, and the reported threats made to witnesses about keeping silent, there remained the simple fact that Mogul assemblies were mostly weather balloons, tinfoil, and balsa wood. So how would the chief intelligence officer, as well as the base commander, mistake such mundane material and announce it to the world as a flying saucer? Also somewhat damning was that the General Accounting Office found that all communications in and out of the Roswell base for the period had been destroyed without authorization. But as there was no smoking gun, Roswell would remain a mystery. Today, if the interpretations of the UFO phenomenon have changed dramatically since 1947, they still seem to be defined by those ancient catalysts of myth, fear and hope. And if the major media now mostly ignore the subject, the internet boils over with it. Tens of millions of hits on UFOs will bring up countless photos and videos, and the conspiracy wrinkle of the moment. There's little doubt that fringe mythology now obscures the actual phenomenon, marginalizing it more than at any time in its history. So even though people continue to see the same things in the sky, and surveys show that half the population believe we're being visited, there remains little possibility that a serious scientific study will take up the question.
We in academia have it made, after all. Especially scientists in academia. We're kind of at the top of the pecking order. And in order to maintain that illusion, which is what it is, we've got to not appear the fool. So the majority of the scientific community is a very non-risk-taking group of people that live in a rather small reality and are in fact scared of things which seem to be outside that reality.
The reality, almost never mentioned with this subject, is that our universe is 13.7 billion years old, and our solar system formed only 4.6 billion years ago. That makes us, in all probability, the new kids on a very old block. In all likelihood, the first advanced intelligence in our galaxy has at least a few billion years head start on us. In other words, the version of contact that we typically imagine, the version that has us as more or less equal, is almost certainly a myth we create to shield us from a reality that is beyond our ability to understand. The belief by many that if we're being visited, they'd stop by and say hello may make about as much sense as us leaning over an anthill and saying, "Take me to your leader." In this light, the suggestion that a far more advanced intelligence might create an intermediate hybrid race to communicate with or to absorb an emerging civilization is an idea hardly less reasonable than any other.
Our little drama.
Still, it may turn out that the debunkers are right. The unknown objects flying around our atmosphere just mistaken identity, the wishful thinking of our race as it looks out on a vast mystery. But of the countless thousands of reports worldwide since 1947, there are at least many hundreds that are strongly compelling. Multiple observers, simultaneous instrument trackings, performance that defies our understanding of physics. Are all of them just the mythic projection of our hopes and fears? Our unconscious way of seeing our meaning in a universe that seems indifferent to our presence?
And in the center, just you and me.
Or are they a mysterious reality from which our myths take root and grow and lead us onward towards our destiny? Though I've never seen anything that's unambiguously a UFO, after spending a few years on this, I'd say if some of these things are not someone from somewhere else, you could blow me over with a feather. I'm still standing.
In the early decades of the 20th century, Charles Fort, who was an eccentric American writer, collected these reports and reports of other kinds of extraordinary anomalies, natural or paranatural. And in a book published in 1919 called The Book of the Damned, actually presented the first draft of what would be called the extraterrestrial hypothesis, theorizing that these events and these sites and these reports suggested the presence of otherworldly visitors. When UFOs appeared and became an international sensation in the summer of 1947 and after that, within days of Kenneth Arnold's sighting on June 24, 1947, speculation about Martian visitors began to appear in the press. Almost all of it came from people who had read Charles Fort's book. Charles Fort himself had died in 1932. But that was the people who first thought these things could be from outer space. Otherwise, people thought they were Russian experiments or secret aircraft experiments of the Navy, or there were all kinds of natural explanations. Some people thought they were an artifact of atomic testing and so on. Not very many people, except the followers of Charles Fort, were thinking about spaceships from other planets. But eventually, by the mid-1950s, the association of UFOs and extraterrestrial visitors was quite widespread, but it wasn't automatic and natural. It took a while. In fact, some of the first people who thought that UFOs could be extraterrestrial spacecraft were in the Air Force, because people in the Air Force understood just how extraordinary the apparent technology of these things was. They knew that there was no earthly power that could duplicate that technology. They understood that in a way the general public probably didn't.
Well, no one truly knows exactly what was going on. However, we know that since T2 Intelligence was doing aeronautical analysis from the German technology that they brought back from World War II, from the Russians, that these objects obviously were not coming from Russia, nor were they coming from the stash of old aircraft and the Horten brothers and things in Germany at the time. So they could only come to one conclusion. They're not ours, they're not theirs, they're from somewhere else. And this kind of put a big kibosh on the military careers of many of the people at T2 Intelligence at Wright Field.
According to the story, all the copies of the estimate of the situation were destroyed, but that couldn't have been true, because, as a matter of fact, we have several people who said they saw one including Captain Ruppelt himself and the Pentagon's major person at the so-called UFO desk in 1952, Major Dewey Fournet.
They said that it was interplanetary and that it was intelligently controlled and interplanetary. Fournet, who saw the whole document, said, listen, these guys were trying to shake the tree up in Washington. This was a preliminary thing, and he said he didn't see that he read the report, he didn't see that they had the evidence to make this conclusion. But it's an estimate of the situation. 10 minutes after you write, I worked in intelligence. 10 minutes after you write an estimate of situation, it's stale.
The first major UFO proponent was a retired Marine Corps major named Donald Kehoe. Kehoe worked in the Pentagon. He had once been an aide to Colonel Charles Lindbergh. He had all kinds of contacts. He was a popular writer. He wrote stories, adventure stories in pulp magazines, usually with an aviation theme.
He also wrote fiction stories about World War I flying. And I read those things every time they came out. 10 cents a copy, little pulp magazines, beautiful things.
So when True magazine, which was a very popular men's magazine back years and years ago, decided that it wanted to look into the question of what flying saucers were, it thought, well, Don Kehoe is a good guy. He's got all these Pentagon contacts. He knows about aviation, knows a lot of pilots, and many pilots are reporting UFOs. So he spent about 8 months investigating the story for True magazine, and the article that he published in the January 1950 issue of True was titled, "The Flying Saucers Are Real."
And Donald Kehoe became probably the most important person in the history of UFOs. That article, which came at the very end of the year, was sort of a psychological bomb for many people because it seemed to expose a hypocrisy in Air Force intelligence, and not only that, seemed to rather clearly point to the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
When he was making a discussion with me, and he was essentially telling me, that I was not doing the right thing to the job. And I told him that, well, in a way, it's your fault, because if you hadn't written those stories and gotten me so interested in the Air Force, I wouldn't be here.
Did they make you want to be a pilot or something?
Yes, it did.
Kehoe concluded from interviewing his Air Force contacts, interviewing pilots, other credible witnesses, that flying saucers were coming to Earth probably from Mars. That sounds rather ridiculous today, but in those days, even many reputable scientists thought it was at least possible that Mars harbored an intelligent civilization. This was before the space probes and other advances told us that this was not possible. But at the time, it was considered a reasonable speculation that Mars was inhabited. Kehoe thought they were peaceful. They were coming here with good intentions, but they were afraid of us because we had sent our interceptor aircraft after them. And so they were shy about establishing contact. But they were watching us, and they'd started watching us intensely because they began monitoring our atomic bombs. This was a version of the extraterrestrial hypothesis for the UFO age. In 1957, he assumed directorship of an organization called the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which brought together all kinds of people with solid professional and middle-class credentials to argue for interplanetary visitation, to lobby for congressional hearings. NICAP began as a hugely ambitious operation, but the funding that Kehoe had counted on did not materialize. That's an interesting story in itself. But in the late 1950s, up until the later 1960s, Kehoe and NICAP represented respectable pro-UFO opinion. And this was at a time when, although there was a great deal of skepticism, the idea that UFOs could be real, even extraterrestrial, was not quite the marginalized idea that it would become in later years.
I think that scientists at the time, despite the interest that was there in possible life in outer space and the knowledge of astronomy and what was possible in terms of solar systems and chemistry in the galaxy, scientists basically had literally no conception that aliens could potentially visit here.
You trust the big paradigm maker at the time. And the big paradigm maker at the time is Einstein, and by gum, you don't go against Einstein. He told you this. He put the 10-pound finger on you. You cannot go faster than the speed of light.
Special relativity and the speed of light, how much impact did that have in scientists' ability to take a look?
I think in considering the possibility of, let's say, ET visitation or even ourselves going out and exploring other stars in the future, even though general relativity had come along and it actually changed that picture, most scientists with an instant response would think on special relativity terms and say, well, the velocity of light is a limitation. You can't go faster than the speed of light. And therefore, to conceive of us exploring stars or other people coming here, it's too far. They just can't get from here to there. We might explore our own solar system, but that's probably as far as we're going to get. But the truth of the matter is that in general relativity, that's not the case. There are options there. And in fact, one of my favorite examples was when Carl Sagan was putting together his book and movie Contact. He wanted to have some kind of more or less instant connection to faraway locales. And so he approached Kip Thorne at Caltech, who was a friend of his, and says, I want this to be as scientifically reasonable as possible. And so Kip decided to look into the possibility out of general relativity that you could beat the speed of light. Well, it turns out that in general relativity, we can begin to talk about manipulating the space-time variables, which was not the case in special relativity. And then, in fact, you could, say, make wormholes, which is sort of be like subways through space or whatever. So he came back and told Carl, no, you can incorporate that. But he got sufficiently interested as a theoretical physicist that he began having his graduate students look into these more bizarre outcomes, predictions from general relativity. And so, in fact, they came up with ways that you could beat the speed of light with the so-called wormhole shortcuts through space-time. But, of course, now that's become a very legitimate area of general relativity research. And so there's a lot of work going on looking at wormholes, so-called warp drives. In the end, it may turn out that wormholes, there's a possibility of engineering them, and people are still looking at that, at least the principles of it. Warp drive is, as far as we can see, is going to be tough. Well, here we are at the beginning of the 21st century, and so we know there's going to be a 24th and a 28th and a 30th century science. And the scientists of those years are going to look back and see how primitive we were. So really a scientist, if he's up to it, can't rule out anything.
I have several editions of an astronomy textbook out, and I talk about this limit of the speed of light, and I put a footnote in there saying something like, at least according to our current understanding of physics. And I got a moderately irate letter from some scientist, this is outrageous that you would put this in. And I thought, well, how outrageous for him, is he really on record that our physics of 1987 or whenever this was is the last word? I mean, it doesn't mean you should start assuming things can go faster than light, but you just shouldn't assume that we know everything. And as Arthur Clarke said, any superior intelligence is going to look like magic to us. Exactly. Anything that violates our crude understanding of the universe that we have.
We have to assume that our understanding of the universe
Sure we do, yeah. And you have to be ready for the thing that's out there that violates it.
I'm always reminded back in the late 1890s how the head of the British Academy of Science said, we know it all, we're just wrapping up the details.
And there's who was it Haldane or one of the famous British scientists, the space flight is utter bilge, is a famous line. Yeah.
I mean, I love Planck's phrase, which can be paraphrased, that is, how does science go forward? And he says, funeral by funeral.
So I really don't think it was only light speed. Again, it was more sociological, psychological, and philosophical reasoning that led scientists to reject UFO sightings. Now, there's another one there too. This is a corollary to the if we don't know it, if we aren't aware of it, it can't be true. We the scientists, will not use data that comes from the public, that comes from the great unwashed. And of course, physicists and astronomers, well, at least the physicists don't ever do this, or chemists. Astronomers do a little bit with amateur astronomers, but other scientists don't, and they're just not used to saying, well, we could be getting some valuable evidence from people who are out there.
One of the themes that comes out in the early history of ufology was that the UFOs weren't actually there for investigation, but the people who reported them were. And this is what led to a whole group of psychological kinds of interpretations, and then they were essentially negative ones. The person's stupid, they're lying, they're drunk, they don't know what they're talking about, they're crazy. And then you let off the hook, right? There's no real challenge to science. There's no real challenge to what you currently believe, because it's this person's problem, something wrong with them. So you don't have to rethink things like interstellar travel, interdimensionality, whatever, might or might not be out there.
There was a terrific example of this that's in my chapter in there, and it was a Russian spacecraft satellite called Zond 4, I think it was. And that was a big rocket booster, and that re-entered over the United States, came in through the atmosphere, as we know from modern films and the disastrous shuttle breakup and things like that. These things come in, start to glow, they get hot from friction with the atmosphere, they start to break up just like a meteorite or a fireball, and you get a string of fragments. And I've actually seen one of these. I saw one of the shuttle tanks re-enter over Hawaii once, and it's amazing, it's remarkable. It's like a big mass of fireworks. The one I saw, they were all kind of sparkling, and they're moving across the sky together, because there's like the big piece out in front and some smaller pieces behind. And they're slowly spreading out, but what you see moving across the sky is that string of lights together. And we could say that's the perception in this case. Now, I was given on the Condon Commission a folder of what I remember is something like 150 or 200 reports of this. And one of the strangest things I experienced there was that in general, the people who knew what they were looking at, the people who said, gee, that must be a satellite re-entering the atmosphere and breaking up, they gave the shortest and crispest reports. I saw this bright thing, some lights in the sky, I think maybe it was a satellite breaking up. It's kind of the end of the story. The people who most badly misconceived it, they conceived that they saw something else, gave the most elaborate and detailed reports. And some great examples of that. There were even a progression of stages. There were the people who, as I say, the people who said, oh, this is satellite, end of story. Then there were the people who were describing what they saw, and they said, I saw a string of lights in a kind of in a line moving across the sky. Well, that's basically absolutely accurate. Great example of the perception correctly reported as a conception, and so on. Then there were people who started introducing a very subtle difference. There were people who said, I saw a set of lights flying in formation across the sky. A little bit of a different idea there. It's the idea that somehow they're under control. I just was re-looking at that chapter that I wrote, and I noticed there was a person who said they were flying in perfect military formation. Now, if you know what he saw, that's not a bad description. But on the other hand, if you come in and you're talking to this guy the next day and he says, I saw these things flying in military formation, you think, well, were these really a bunch of different craft flying along in military formation? That's not what he saw, but that's his conception. Right. And then finally, we get to this end, as I say, with the detailed descriptions. There were people who said, I saw a black cigar-shaped object with a row of lights. And of course, they didn't see the black cigar-shaped object. They conceived that it had to be there, because there had to be something for those lights to be attached to. Then there were the people who said, I saw a black cigar-shaped object with a row of lighted windows. And we absolutely had reports like that. And then the last 2 or 3 that were the furthest off, you know, I saw the cigar-shaped object, the windows, it was so close we could have seen people inside the windows if there had been anybody in there. My dog was barking and whimpering, and there were fires in the fields outside of town the next day, and, you know, all of that. And, you know, you come in as a either an experienced and maybe an inexperienced UFO report, you know, investigator, looking for reports of alien craft, you know, those sound like pretty good reports. And so, you know, they're all the same thing, and they were all a satellite breaking up in the atmosphere. So really tough to translate those into real understanding.
As proof of the extraterrestrial hypothesis remained elusive, some ufologists began to look in other directions. And some of the more Fortean-inclined ufologists, the ones who were attracted to the idea that UFOs were part of a broad range of anomalies and mysteries, speculation grew that there weren't extraterrestrial visitors, that these were actually paranormal entities who...
This around what year, Drew?
In the 1960s, about the mid-1960s, the idea begins to form that UFOs really aren't what they appear to be. They may not even be craft, they may not even represent a technology in the ordinarily understood sense of those words, that these were actually shape-shifting entities from some unknown other world, a parallel universe, a demonic realm, something like that. And there was an attempt to link flying saucers not only with other weird phenomena that people reported, like strange creatures and so on, but also to traditional folkloric entities like fairies and angels and demons, which were also interpreted as not literal entities, but as representations of kind of cultural expectations about supernatural experience. These things existed in some sense. The experiences of them were real, but excuse me.
Okay, no problem.
But they weren't what they appeared to be. That they really were something else, representing some kind of unknown other reality. The most influential writers in this new school were Jacques Vallée and John Keel. In 1969, Jacques Vallée wrote a book called Passport to Magonia, where he links modern UFOs to traditional beliefs about fairies, demons, gods, entities of various kinds.
At the time Passport to Magonia was published, it was looked on more as an ancient astronaut type text rather than a real subversion of the whole extraterrestrial hypothesis. Most people read it and said, well, okay, so the aliens must have been around from time immemorial. You know, this is just more evidence for the same. But in fact, what Vallée was saying was something quite different, was that that UFOs are just a part of some larger mystery.
John Keel, who was much less intellectually sophisticated, but just as influential as Vallée, wrote several books in which he revived traditional demonology. And he argued that UFOs and their entities and all kinds of other strange creatures were literally demonic entities. He didn't say they were from hell, but he renamed hell the super spectrum. The super spectrum was also related to the traditional occult idea of the etheric realm, a realm on another level of vibrational frequency.
It did sort of mesh with the spirit of the times. The idea of getting away from technology, scientists and government as the good guys, which, you see in all those 1950s monster outer space movies. The heroes are always scientists and soldiers. Complete revolution there. They become the villains. And the counterculture, the notion of a new age, belief in a more spiritual sort of thing becomes very popular. So this idea of Vallée is that there might be some kind of mysterious force in almost a Star Wars sense.
The control mechanism.
Yeah, is out there and is responsible for many manifestations of the paranormal. That quickly caught on.
Now, to critics, this was really an abdication of reason, logic, and science, that this was really a reversion to magical thinking and a rejection of science and reason as the right tools with which to investigate phenomena. But the absence of conclusive proof for these, extraordinary phenomena was very frustrating to a lot of people. And some people had come to this less as scientists than as mystery mongers. They weren't really hard, clear thinkers. Vallée was trained as a scientist. Vallée was trained as an astrophysicist. Vallée was intellectually sophisticated and not as inclined to rank paranoia as Keel and his followers were, but still underlying his reading of what was going on was really magical thinking that really had as much to do with traditional occultism as with science. Out of the paranormal school of ufological theory, there evolved the so-called psychosocial hypothesis, which actually rejected paranormal processes, but did see UFO reports and experiences as part of a broad range of folkloric, supernatural phenomena. But instead of ascribing them to demons or parallel universes or some other unknowable place, held them to be psychological phenomena, sometimes extraordinary psychological phenomena. This school really grew among European ufologists, and to this day is fairly popular in Europe, representing a kind of skeptical ufology, which is making its own variety of extraordinary claims.
They tend very much to look for answers in what you might call tradition. The idea that that certain ideas have been passed along. They want to find cultural antecedents. Here's the same imagery as abductions. We can find it in science fiction. We can find it in stories of fairy kidnap. You can find it in all sorts of cultural predecessors. That doesn't mean that there's some kind of organizing force. It just means that it has something to do with the way we think and believe. Right. And there's really no mysterious unknown phenomenon involved.
Critics of paranormal and psychosocial approaches to UFO theory pointed out that there is a body of physical evidence for the presence of something anomalous that seems irreducible, that doesn't seem amenable to prosaic explanation or to being contained within known knowledge at this stage. And so they would respond to psychosocial theorists and paranormalists as saying, this isn't all just airy-fairy stuff. This isn't all subjective. There actually is some objective evidence that something strange is going on. And the paranormalists and the psychosocial skeptics could never really adequately rebut this argument. And eventually, some ufologists who had gone over to the paranormal or psychosocial side said, yes, the physical evidence is really the core evidence. It really is at the core of the controversy.
It's amazing how quickly galaxies have formed. The Hubble Space Telescope did a couple of very deep surveys, very long exposures, to look for the most distant clusters and individual galaxies, and found that galaxies formed sometime around the first billion-year age of the universe. And so that means the stars, of course, which constitute galaxies, have been around that long. So a civilization could be rather old. You have to assume, of course, that evolution took place, and that takes some time. But certainly civilizations at least 1 billion years older than ours are theoretically possible, maybe even much older than that.
The first one generation of stars has to go by, I think 4 to 5 billion years for heavy
Well,
elements.
it depends. I mean, the very heaviest stars evolve pretty quickly. They evolve in time scales of even less than 1 billion years.
Oh.
So it's possible that there could be civilizations that are very, very old.
What would the limit you think be?
Well, just say 10 billion years. That'd be about twice as old as the.
A civilization could be 10 billion years, or?
Well, I suppose so. I mean, if a civilization evolved during the first, say, 4 billion years of existence of the universe, then that's not out of the question. More conservatives say it's easy to imagine a civilization at least 1 billion years older than we are. Leave it at that. 10 billion, well, it's kind of stretching it, but it's not out of the question in my view.
The universe is really old compared to our age. Not super old, because you can imagine one 1 trillion years old, and we're not nearly close to that, but it's pretty old. And what that means is, and particularly with recent astronomical discoveries, is that in fact the average civilization in the galaxy, how can I even speak of that? Because just pick the average age of a planet like Earth. In other words, in a solar system, what would be the average age of a solar system, or like a sun-like solar system? The answer is 1 billion years older than ours. So when you start imagining what 1 billion-year-old civilization would be like, the answer is, I can't imagine it. So I can imagine almost anything, including, yes, the Earth is just a place to come and enjoy the local natives and or what have you. But it really means that almost anything is possible, to be honest. So I find it difficult. My mind does begin to reel, actually, when I think about billion-year civilizations.
Well, so a lot of people will say something like, what would a technology be like that's 1 billion years in advance of us? I say, hey, I don't need 1 billion years. Give me 1,000 years. And if you don't think that would be kind of amazing, just think back 1,000 years and hand some guy living in the 11th century a light bulb, let alone a generator or a nuclear power plant.
I have an answer.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that may have been left out of the famous Drake equation about trying to estimate what fraction of solar systems have planets, what fraction of those planets have life, blah, 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 is that technical civilizations may only last 1,000 years or 10,000 years. I don't know. I'm not sure we can be that optimistic about our own culture, what we're seeing.
It's true. We may replace
and whether we get off the Earth and get out there before we use up all the resources. I mean, we may only have one shot at doing that. So it may be that the fraction of cultures that are around long enough to be interested is small. Plus, then there's the evolutionary window that you're only a species for 10 million years. That's kind of the turnover time for evolution. So the idea that cultures, once they achieve space travel, remain interested in everybody else, seems small to me. I don't think that's probably likely.
I guess the point is simply that Fermi's paradox is a bigger paradox now than it was 50, 60 years ago when Fermi first made his famous quip. So we've got to face up to it, and I think that the problem is that the scientific community is unwilling to consider the possibility that in this giant morass, which is the field of UFO reports, that there might be lurking some really valid signal. It's just a mindset that can't be, and I think that's actually to the detriment of science.
I and Bernie Hayes, Bruce Maccabee, Jim Deardorff put together a paper for the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society, which is a very well-respected journal, and first covered we began with Fermi's paradox, famous claimed expression by Fermi, which did take place, when he said, well, all astrophysicists looking out at all those stars and all those galaxies know that unless we want to really be pumped up with hubris, there's got to be other ET civilizations out there. Furthermore, if you look at the statistics of travel, even if you're very conservative and say you can't beat the speed of light, and each time you go to a new star, you stay there for 1,000,000 years before you go off to look at another star, nonetheless, you end up saying the galaxy should be colonized by now. Because after all, we're a relatively young star. We're less than 4 billion years old. We've got stars in our galaxy 10 billion years old. That's plenty of time for us to be colonized, so where are they? And the answer at the time, this is back in, I don't know, 40s, 50s, was, well, probably speed of light limitation. So looking at that, we said, okay, well, that limitation now has begun to evaporate due to the new understandings and predictions coming out of general relativity. So that's not the issue. Well, what about what Condon said in his report? Well, that's not really an issue either, because we now have better data, better sightings, more evidence. So it finally came down to, at least in that paper, we talked about a couple of cases that Bruce Maccabee had been directly involved in investigating that seemed pretty good. And then you finally get to the issue of, well, if that's the case, then why don't we see the evidence? Well, you can claim that UFO sightings are possibly evidence, but of course that hasn't met the scientific standard of really being proven. And then the question is, well, if they're kind of here but they're not showing themselves, why is that? One possibility is that if you're a super advanced race, you've got super advanced technology, what's of value to you? You don't need slaves, you don't need minerals out of the ground, you don't need this, you don't need that. You can basically make whatever you want. So the only thing of value would be the intellectual property and creativity of an uncontaminated species. Uncontaminated being the key. So they show up here and say, whoa, internal combustion machine, who would have thought of that? Or look at those musical scales. Now that's really something. And but the minute they land and we shake their hands, 100 years were them, and we've lost our value. And also, as we know from interacting with primitive societies, the shock can disrupt the society. Presumably they would know that too. So what Deardorff likes to point out is that, okay, they're not going to make themselves immediately known for obvious reasons, because it would destroy our value to them. On the other hand, and it would be a shock. And on the other hand, they know it's only a matter of time, even if it's only when we get our own spaceships, go out there and run into them. So we do have to kind of be brought along in our maturity to accept this as a possibility. And so kind of a covert peekaboo process would be the favored one. And, you know, that could be the case. Obviously, we don't know for sure.
There's almost nothing I can think of good that would come from landing and making contact with another civilization that is not either comparable to yours in development or is so sophisticated that they can handle it. And when you think about the scenarios we can all dream of, science fiction, about contacting, in other words, we're the aliens and we have this ability to travel, we develop this technology, we start flying around the galaxy, we encounter another civilization that's less advanced than us, would we land? And the answer is, I certainly would not.
I certainly wouldn't.
Yeah. And I won't go through the long list of bad things that can happen, but it is a long list. And so it, by the way, raises the question of when could contact even occur? When you think about it that way, and you realize that despite all the science fiction stuff, in fact, I think that societies would pull back from contact and not do it. When does it happen, actually? And that, to me, is the more profound question. And I don't have an answer to that.
There is an awful lot of assuming that they would be like us, and I tend to fall into that trap frequently. Pretty hard. And it's very hard not to do it. It may be, of course, that if the extraterrestrial intelligence was sufficiently different from us, we would not recognize it. We would not know it was there. We couldn't make sense of it. and possibly vice versa.
Yeah.
But certainly we don't know how technology is going to progress. Right now, it seems to be accelerating, going very, very fast. Will it level off? Will it taper? Will there be various plateaus? But the differentness of extraterrestrial intelligence is something that has to be taken into account when we think about the possibilities of contact and if contact is going to occur. And, we might not notice it. I mean, sad but true.
Well, there could be good reasons why they don't say hello. It could be that they're trying to keep our civilization from suddenly imploding because we're encountering something that's beyond our ability to assimilate. It could be that this is part of the plan to bring a new civilization into the fold, to gradually expose the phenomenon. I think that there are a lot of reasons why they wouldn't just come and land here if they so chose.
Our own experience with South Pacific civilizations encountering European technology, in the 19th century, should answer the question. I mean, those civilizations were practically destroyed.
Well, in fact, it's true. When we encountered ourselves more primitive civilizations, we tended to destroy them, but it may be even more severe than that. I mean, we don't tend to try to initiate contact with a group of ants, do we? We don't know how far advanced a civilization might be. I'd be surprised if we were tens of thousands, but certainly decades or even centuries I would see as a possible timescale for making contact known. If you look at UFO reports, they're oftentimes extremely convincing to the people who see them, who witness them, but the event never lasts long enough, never has enough exposure to sort of rise to the surface of national attention. And it could be that is part of a deliberate strategy. I mean, that could be one way to gradually make us collectively as a civilization realize that there's more to reality than what we experience every day around us, but without suddenly upsetting the whole apple cart, without suddenly sort of challenging all of our structures and our politics and our economics, which could be very devastating.
Here's another thought. Maybe it's already taking place. Maybe that, flying around or whatever in a kind of liminal way, right at the margins of our reality, is in fact the first step towards a contact. That contact would not be something which would be abrupt, but maybe is designed to take place over thousands of years, so that the impact on us is...
Yeah, this is actually how, if I were in charge, how I would manage contact. And this is sort of getting back to this idea of the dawning realization that, if everyone reaches the same conclusion at once, it would be very exciting. If slowly more and more people are drawn into one position or the other, and then finally there's just a very small group of holdouts that maintain a contrary view. Why, in the case of something like contact, if we're talking about civilizations billions of years older than us, what would be the rush? In modern North America, we're always in a rush. We wouldn't think of building a cathedral, say, over a period of 800 years, as was done in medieval times, give or take a few years. But if something were truly momentous, then indeed it could take place very, very slowly over many people's lifetimes. And what this would mean, if it were to take place over many people's lifetimes, is that there would always be a growing group of people who quote, think something's going on, with a lot of other people who still don't agree with them. But why would there be a rush requirement in something as delicate and portentous, you might say, is contacting another civilization?
Well, this becomes more just trite, which is that you're ready for it. I mean, you're really ready for it, meaning that you are at such a level that it will not affect your social mores, it will not affect your technological underpinnings, because in fact, the best way for aliens to completely screw us up is to land here and say, here's the box for free energy, go use it. And all of a sudden everything here just falls apart. Why there have to be gasoline stations? Oh, gee, all those people just lost their jobs. And why? I mean, you just go on and on and on, and just the whole place becomes a nightmare of, So you have to have a society that can handle this contact, whatever that means. And I can just conceive of it in my 21st century, small human mind here, which I don't think is big enough necessarily to get our arms around it. But I do think we're a long way away from it. But what would be the appropriate moment for contact? And so That's another reason why I'm pessimistic. I used about scientists. I think I'm realistic about whether or not we can expect contact, and my realism says no, actually.
It's an interesting set of challenges. I personally am not as worried about these sort of fierce, destructive aliens as a lot of people are, because I think what we're finding out through political science is that there are a lot of forces that tend to put really aggressive societies out of business. And it's not a popular message when I talk to people who've read the morning paper. It's less popular now with what's going on in the Mideast, but there's a lot of growing evidence within political science on the kinds of conditions that lead to peaceful coexistence and why they're likely to prevail. And what I have to do as a psychologist is, if I'm trying to imagine what ET might be like, is while being aware of the problem of anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism and so forth, is to try to say, okay, now what's out there that seems to be pretty robust? What is there out there that we have learned that applies in different historical epochs, that cuts across cultures and may cut across species? And those are the things that I see as fairly useful hypotheses, to try to follow up.
Such as?
Interstellar tit for tat or negotiation. That if in fact you find a communicative civilization, and if in fact there is a way to communicate in a time frame that's meaningful, what you do is you indicate an interest in collaboration and getting along, sharing information and so forth, but you don't just sort of give it all away at once. You wait for some sort of reciprocal concession. It's known as the golden rule. It's known as tit for tat. There's a number of other names for it. It appears in science. It appears in biology. It appears in social science. It appears in religion. And given the universality of reciprocal relationships, that's one way to start thinking about bargaining or interacting with ET.